Well, welcome everybody to the next installment of the online Peace Science Colloquium sponsored by the Peace Science Society International. I'm Toby Ryder, an associate professor at Texas Tech University, and I'm the guest moderating today for Emily Ritter, who coordinates the colloquium, but who could not be here today. So this series includes exciting and ongoing research from members of the Peace Science community and allows us to continue engaging over research beyond the annual meeting. So today we're honored to have Rachel Stein, who's an assistant professor of political science at George Washington. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you.
And she'll be presenting The Face of the Enemy, Image, Stereotypes, and the Perception of Threat. And we are joined today by three fantastic discussants. We've got, and I hope I get everyone's affiliations correct, we've got Shana, Gadarian, an associate professor from the Department of Political Science at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse. We've got Marcus Holmes, who's an assistant professor of government at William & Mary. And we have Elizabeth Zechmeister, who's a professor of political science at Vanderbilt. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming, and thanks for reading the paper. And at this point, we'll turn it over to Rachel, who'll do a short presentation, about 15 minutes of her work. For those watching, you can find the paper on the Peace Science Society Colloquium website if you want to download that and take it a look. So take it away, Rachel.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks to all the discussants for being here, and to the moderator as well. So let me get my presentation going here. All right. All right, can you see the slides? Anybody?
Yes, we can see them.
Okay, great, excellent. All right, well, again, thank you all for being here. So this is some new work that I've just started embarking on. So this is very much kind of a plausibility probe to see if this is a promising direction for research. So the big question that is motivating my thinking overall, and this paper is just a small slice of that, is how do ordinary citizens determine whether a particular actor or event, particularly in the international system, represents a serious threat to them and to their country. And we know from previous research that public perceptions of threat can have an important impact on the course of both domestic and foreign policy. And if you study international relations, of course, the most important part of this is a whole series of findings showing that threat is one of the main drivers of hawkish foreign policy preferences in the public. And I think one of the important things to recognize about sort of popular threat perceptions as opposed to threat perceptions at the elite or leader level is that unlike leaders, citizens experience politics and especially international affairs indirectly. For them, sort of what happens beyond their country's borders comes to them through their television screens, their newspapers, their radios, and increasingly through social media. And so for this reason, existing research tells us media coverage has an independent causal effect on public opinion. And of particular importance is the visual aspect of many forms of media. Visual images can and do have an important impact on public opinion, and that's above and beyond the factual content that they accompany. So consequently, I think media portrayals of foreign adversaries do have the potential to profoundly shape how people understand the nature of the enemy that they're facing, and therefore how they want their leaders to deal with that enemy. And in particular, there's a pronounced tendency in media coverage of crises and conflicts to personify the enemy. That is, to use individual leaders to stand in for abstract entities like groups or states. So Osama bin Laden stands in for Al-Qaeda in the wider war on terror. Muammar Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein, of course, for Iraq. And these images can be incredibly pervasive. For instance, I ran across this, what I think is a pretty stunning fact. In the aftermath of 9/11, the image of Osama bin Laden was so ubiquitous that he actually appeared on American television more frequently than President George W. Bush. So I think in this way, through media coverage, the face of a particular leader often becomes the face of the enemy for ordinary people. So why does the face of the enemy matter? To summarize my argument just briefly, I think it matters because these images facilitate categorization and the application of stereotypes. And these stereotypes in turn serve as an important heuristic for determining the degree of threat posed by the outgroup or a specific member of the outgroup. However, that's not the whole story, because not all stereotypes are equally relevant to the perception of threat, and not all images are equally likely to activate those stereotypes. So which stereotypes can we say are most relevant to the perception of threat from outgroups? So here I'm building heavily on a paper from 2013 by Sides and Gross. And they argue, based on a long tradition of research on stereotyping, that stereotypes have two general key dimensions: warmth and competence. The warmth dimension encompasses basically trustworthiness and aggression. So negative warmth stereotypes, that is stereotypes of an outgroup as untrustworthy and violent, have been linked to increased threat perception from that group. Competence is based on the dimensions of intelligence and hardworkingness, and it's less clear here, both theoretically and empirically, how competence translates into threat. Is an individual or a group more threatening if they are very competent or if they are very incompetent? It's also been suggested, at least theoretically, that competence could interact with warmth such that the most threatening outgroup is one that is both untrustworthy, violent, and highly competent. But in their study, Sides and Gross, who look at attitudes towards the war on terror as their dependent variables, they don't find any main effect of competence or any interaction with warmth. So on the basis of those findings, I focus my theory and my empirics, at least in this paper, specifically on warmth stereotypes. So the next critical question is, which images are likely to make these warmth stereotypes salient to people's perception of threats? And not all images, I argue, will have the same effect on the salience of outgroup stereotypes. And the key factor here, based on prior research, I think, is stereotypicality, which means basically the fit between the individual and the attributes of that group. And there's lots and lots of research showing that stereotypes are applied much more readily to individuals who look or behave stereotypically as opposed to counter-stereotypical individuals. So this leads me to posit three preliminary hypotheses, and I'll go through them quickly here. So the first concerns the salience of warmth stereotypes to the perception of threat from the outgroup. So I hypothesize that outgroup warmth stereotypes will be more salient to the perception of threat in the presence of a stereotypical enemy leader image as opposed to a counter-stereotypical leader image. My second hypothesis is that the use of a stereotypical leader image in media coverage as compared to a counter-stereotypical image will increase the perception of threat amongst those individuals who hold the strongest negative outgroup warmth stereotypes. And finally, I hypothesize that the use of a stereotypical leader image in media coverage of a crisis or conflict should increase the overall or aggregate level of threat perception in the population, but the size of that increase should depend on the prevalence of negative outgroup warmth stereotypes. So if those negative stereotypes are very prevalent in the population at large, we would think that the use of a stereotypical leader image should have a significant effect in increasing threat perception as opposed to a counter-stereotypical image. So in terms of the empirics in the paper, again, this is very preliminary, so the survey was conducted on mTurk. It's just a convenience sample, so I don't make any claims about the representativeness of this group. It's also a fairly small sample size. I want to see whether there was really any there. So about 645 respondents. And participants in this study were just randomly assigned to read one of two hypothetical newspaper articles about the discovery of a secret nuclear program in Jordan. And if there's interest, I can talk in the Q&A portion about sort of why I chose this particular scenario. So in terms of the experimental treatment, the factual content of the article is all kept the same for all respondents. It was a very content-rich article. I gave them lots of information about Jordan and its relationship with the United States. So the treatment is simply the image accompanying the article. Here you're looking at two images of King Abdullah of Jordan, who is the current leader of Jordan. On the left, a stereotypical image, and on the right, a counter-stereotypical image. And here I'm thinking about stereotypicality in terms of Muslims as the outgroup. So I'd also be happy to talk about the selection of these images and why I view one as stereotypical and the other as counter-stereotypical, if there's interest in that. So just to wrap up, the dependent variables that I'm looking at in this paper are perception of threat to the United States and also perception of threat to Israel, sort of given Jordan's location in the Middle East. And the main independent variable is a measure of warmth stereotypes of Muslims. So let me talk for a second about that measure. So what I'm showing you here, this figure just presents a distribution of warmth stereotypes of Muslims in my sample. So I measured individual differences in warmth stereotypes of Muslims by just asking respondents to rate Muslims as a group along two dimensions. One dimension is peaceful versus violent, and the other is trustworthy versus untrustworthy. And then I combine these two items into the scale that you see here, which ranges from 1 to 7. So people with high scores on this scale, people to the right-hand side of the figure, are people who have strong negative warmth stereotypes of Muslims as a group, viewing them as generally violent and untrustworthy. People who fall to the left side of the scale with low scores are people who generally have positive warmth stereotypes of Muslims. So they actually view them as a group as generally being peaceful and trustworthy. And people who fall in that middle category of 4 are those who are sort of explicitly neutral and didn't hold any bias in one direction or another. So in terms of the distribution of this variable, about 40% of my respondents lay above the midpoint, so they have some degree of negative warmth stereotypes of Muslims. 31% of the respondents lay below the midpoint, so they have some degree of positive warmth stereotypes concerning Muslims, and 28% located themselves at the middle. I should just emphasize once again that this is only the most explicit form of bias. This just directly asks people, do you think Muslims are violent or peaceful? Do you think they are trustworthy or untrustworthy? So we're not picking up any kind of implicit forms of bias or prejudice here. All right, let me show you some results. So first, I'm going to show you some results concerning the salience of warmth stereotypes in the perception of threat to the United States and Israel. So I'll start first with the results for the United States, which are on your left. And here you can see that when people receive the counter-stereotypical image, warmth stereotypes have a small and statistically insignificant effect on perceptions of threat. In contrast, amongst the group that received the stereotypical image, here warmth stereotypes, and particularly more negative warmth stereotypes, so higher values on that scale, are a positive and significant predictor of the perception of threat to the United States. So consistent with my first hypothesis, what it appears at least is that the stereotypical image of King Abdullah does something to activate respondents' stereotypes of Muslims, particularly concerning violence and trustworthiness, causing them to rely more on those beliefs when evaluating the threat posed by Jordan's nuclear program. If you look at the results for Israel, things are quite different here. Interestingly, warmth stereotypes of Muslims have a significant effect on perceptions of threat to Israel, regardless of whether a respondent was in the counter-stereotypical image condition or the stereotypical image condition. Let me move on to the second set of results that I'm going to show you today. So here what we're looking at is the marginal effect of the stereotypical image, or just the difference between the two treatment groups across the range of that warmth stereotypes scale. So here, consistent, at least for the United States, consistent with my second hypothesis, the stereotypical image has a significant positive effect on perception of threat to the United States amongst respondents with the strongest negative warmth stereotypes of Muslims. Simply put, in this case, the stereotypical leader image simultaneously increases threat amongst people with very strong negative warmth stereotypes of Muslims, but also decreases threat perception amongst people with strong positive warmth stereotypes of Muslims. So there's actually a symmetrical effect here. The stereotypical leader image actually impacts people with both strong negative warmth stereotypes and strong positive warmth stereotypes. Again,
2 minutes left, Rachel.
Okay, great, thank you, that's perfect. Again, things look quite different when it comes to Israel. Here, the stereotypical leader image has no significant effect on perception of threat regardless of the respondents' pre-existing stereotypes of Muslims. There is something about shifting the target of threat from the United States to Israel that appears to sap these images of their power in this scenario. So this brings me to my final set of results, specifically concerning whether the stereotypical leader image had any main effect on the overall level of threat perception to the United States. And I find that the answer here, at least, is no. There was not any statistically significant difference in the overall level of threat perception between the two treatment groups. And I think, having inspected the data, that this is due to the fairly even distribution of warmth stereotypes between positive, negative, and neutral. I'll just go back for a second here to the distribution. So this is a fairly symmetrical distribution. And given that the stereotypical image both increased threat perception amongst those with negative warmth stereotypes and decreased threat perception amongst those with positive warmth stereotypes, those effects are essentially canceling each other out. And so when we look on average, we don't find any significant difference between the two treatment groups. I think this might look different in a nationally representative sample. I've looked at some data, and it looks like in national samples, the percentage of people who hold negative warmth stereotypes of Muslims specifically is significantly higher than what I'm getting for the MTurk sample. So it is possible that if I replicated this study with a national sample, some main effect might emerge. I haven't done that yet, mostly because I want to know what people who are smarter than me and who have worked on these topics more thoroughly think, is this a promising avenue to go down, and how could I refine and revise and expand this study in ways that would be interesting and productive. So with that, I will leave it there, and just thank you in advance for taking the time to read the paper and share your comments with me. I'm really looking forward to that.
All right, thank you, Rachel. I think to get us started, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what your plans are for the project. If this is one paper, if this is a larger project, maybe that will help people's framing of comments a little bit, and then we'll just jump into the discussing comments.
Sure. Are you able to see me, or have I not quite gotten myself back on the screen yet?
Well, we lost your slides on the screen share, but we had the audio, but we don't see you now.
So I've taken the slides away.
Okay.
Let me just see. Okay, there, I'm back. So right now, in terms of sort of looking at the role of stereotypes in threat perception, this is sort of a standalone paper, but it derives from a broader interest that I have in thinking about sort of how enemies are constructed for ordinary people in democracies specifically, and what role both political elites and the media play in constructing those enemies. So I do think of it as potentially a larger project. I've got other ideas about how to extend it in various ways. So that's where my thinking is sort of at on the future of this. I've been going around and collecting feedback, seeing whether other people think, this is a promising avenue to go down, and what, might be interesting additions or revisions.
Okay, great. I think now we'll just turn it over to the discussants, and whoever wants to go first can jump right in.
I guess I'll start. Hi, Rachel, Shana.
Hello, hi, Shana.
So I wanted to think a little bit about whether or not, this question of how enemies are created, I think is super interesting. And so I have a couple of questions about whether or not you really care about the image of the leader, or really you're trying to get at a variety of other stereotypes more broadly that are being both activated and or created with these personification of the leaders themselves. Okay, so the first thing I would say is, if you're interested in kind of more broadly thinking about how enemies get created, the work on analogies I think would be really helpful. So Skip Lupia has some work after 9/11 thinking about the ways in which I think it's when Saddam became Osama. I don't know. There's
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. But more kind of more back on thinking about the visuals, I was struck by the arguments that you're making about the personification of the leader, and I actually wonder whether or not the creation of an enemy could be it's broader than just the face of the leader, because any news report that's going to be talking about threats international, yes, they'll have a picture of a leader, but most likely they're having some other set of images as well. And so I'd wonder, thinking about whether or not it's the really activation of the outgroup stereotype, and it's about the violence, and whether or not, or really it's about the trustworthiness, about whether or not you can think of a design that would, if you think it's the face particularly of the enemy that matters, if you can think about teasing out what you think is doing the work, and applying it to other images. So my guess is that you might have seen similar kinds of effects had you used a picture of any kind of violence versus not, right? So that it's not necessarily about the stereotypicality of these images, it's about that they bring up violence, and that you could do that more directly with images of violence rather than these images of Abdullah. So because this actually brings up my other question, and I have lots of questions, but this is going to be my last one right now, is whether or not you have pre-tested these images to know whether or not the stereotypicality is really bringing up violence, or whether that's our assumption because images of Muslims are usually connected to violence in the news.
So should I respond just very quickly?
That's fine with me.
Okay. Those are great comments. I think I care broadly about sort of the processes of enemy construction in the media, and thinking about faces was just kind of my hook into that. especially because it's sort of a phenomenon that I have noted, how frequently the image of a particular individual gets attached to the enemy of the moment, although we haven't seen that happening with ISIS. So that's also interesting as to why it happens in the case of some enemies or not others. But I think I want to think about it more broadly. So your suggestions there are very helpful. And know that images were not pre-tested. So in any, I'm making a lot of assumptions there. So in any future work, I would absolutely want to be much more careful about that and make sure that they are doing what I think they are doing.
I think Elizabeth wants to add on to that point.
Yeah, thanks. Well, thanks for having me be part of this and letting me read the paper, which I really enjoyed. I wanted to build on those comments. I think Shana's hit on a really important set of questions. And so, the question to you, Rachel, is, what is it what's driving the project here? What's the most important question? And then I think the question for the paper is sort of the same, but let me sort of follow up on Shana's comments to say the other thing you could ask is if you had just an image of the Quran, would that have had the same effect? So then the question is it about evoking sort of Muslimness, or is it about evoking violence? Because what Shana said was, maybe if you had an image of violence, maybe that image would be totally separate from any image of or association with Muslims, but just violence. That would be one question. Or, is it that it's sort of making salient Muslim identity, Muslim stereotypes?
Mm-hmm.
And so, to really tease out what is sort of driving the effect that you're finding, it seems like it would be ideal as you go to take this from the convenience sample to a national sample to have some additional cells. The other thing that those additional cells could help you do is to address this issue of personification, because I'm not sure that what you're showing us is that this is the personification of the enemy, unless you have a cell that doesn't have people in it, to which we can compare the results. Broadly speaking, on the paper, you have some really great hooks about sort of the importance of the media in creating enemies and driving up threat perceptions, and you tie to the literature that's been growing on faces. But I don't think that this paper actually speaks to either of those things. The media, yes, sort of indirectly, because that's how we get information, but that is that's such a general, the media is anything, right, that comes at us. So it's really only engaging with the media in that really indirect way. And it's not engaging with faces at all, because his face varies across the two pictures, and in no way that you're actually engaging. And so in one sense, what you do by bringing up that literature is actually flag for the reader that they should pay attention to his face across the two pictures. And what we see right away is that the face actually varies. In one he's smiling and in one he's not, and that becomes a confounder for you. It's forthright of you that you drew our attention to it. So that's a great, but I think that it has to be addressed as you move forward. Ideally, you'd keep as much constant across the treatments as possible, and so that might mean sort of having some help with some tech savvy undergrad who can Photoshop a picture and put the images that you want overlaid on top of the same face of this individual. So that's just not exactly a question, just really piggybacking on Shana's comments to push you toward thinking about other cells that you might have, and ways in which you might refine the frame of the paper to go a bit more narrow on the research question that you're really able to address here, which is sort of under what conditions or what factors activate these stereotypes in ways that affect our threat perceptions.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Those are really helpful comments. I have sort of struggled in terms of, there were a lot of literatures that I read and they influenced my thinking, but yeah, which ones am I really trying to target to make a contribution? And how to sort of match up the research design and what results I can really concretely show. So that I'm still working on. So these comments will be really helpful in that direction. And yes, the images are not holding many things constant that they should. So 100% agree about finding someone more tech savvy to do some photoshopping. And if I'm going to make it about personification, it seems obvious to me in hindsight now that there should be a comparison where the group is not personified, right? So is it actually that people respond a specific way to individuals and faces that they wouldn't to other types of images that might plausibly invoke some of the same stereotypes? And I think that was part of Shana's comments as well. So that's very well taken. Thank you.
Marcus, you wanted to jump in here?
I think
we don't have your audio, Marcus.
No.
Somebody else want to jump in here while we work out Marcus's audio?
Yeah. Sure. So, I mean, if you're thinking about this, right, so like Liz, I like to design other people's experiments that I don't have to do. So we could design you some more experiments, but I also think there's a way for you to think about using some already collected data to help tease out or at least bolster some of what you're trying to do if you're going to do this as a standalone paper. So I was also dubious, and I'm glad that you talked about the main effects, that the this kind of nice sample that you have of people who think Muslims are trustworthy is that's not representative. And so I'm glad that you you noted that. And so I think you could do something relatively quick with something like the ANES, looking at, now I don't know, maybe Liz knows if they have the thermometers for Muslims on the most recent data on the 2016 pilot or going back to 2012. And just looking, if you want to make this as a story about the media, I think you can do that, but you have to really hook into thinking about what it is you think media are doing. So you could do something like look at among people who have different levels of warmth toward, and that's what the thermometers are picking up, Muslims, what is exposure to different types of media doing to their perceptions of, so the ANES isn't going to have questions about perceptions of general threat toward the US, but there are questions about threat from terrorism and threats from perhaps other things, because I'm wondering, I mean, again, how much this has to do with stereotypes about Muslims versus, I mean, or just how specific do the stereotypes need to be? So you seem to be using Muslims to stand in, except that your experiment's really about Jordan.
Yeah.
Right. So do we think that the people's attitudes, like most Americans don't have stereotypes about Jordanians, I imagine, right? But right, but so I don't know if you've seen Nazita Lajavardi's work. She's a grad student at UCSD. She has a project on media coverage of Muslim Americans and Muslims, where she finds that the overwhelming coverage of Muslims and Muslim Americans is very negative, and it's mostly about foreign Muslims, and it's mostly tied to violence. So I think you would be citing that, and then doing a set of analyses with survey data, looking at among people who have both positive and negative attitudes toward Muslims, what is exposure to media coverage doing to their perceptions of threat, and I'm not sure they're going to have this exact questions, but something close by. So that's a possibility to add on to what you've done. It's not going to tell you about what what is doing the work in that media, right? That's what the experiments are for. But it would, if you wanted to make this more of a story about media coverage and how media coverage might be activating people's stereotypes about Muslims, you could do that with survey data, and then think about using a set of experiments like the one maybe Liz recommended, thinking about whether or not it's really about this kind of stereotypes about Islam. Is it really the stereotypes about violence? You know, teasing apart all of the components within a new set of experiments.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. I will definitely check out the ANES data, because I think that would be a valuable addition, and I could can fairly easily take a look at that. It might actually give me some direction too for thinking about a revised experiment with more cells. So thank you. I appreciate that. It's good to go outside the realm of like the survey experiment and bring those things together. I think it works very effectively often.
I also have found that reviewers like that combination much better than trying to just publish with a survey experiment.
Yeah, I've noticed it's a common theme in your work. You're like, here's an analysis of like 3 data sets and 2 experiments.
I'm just going to throw a lot of data at you and see what happens and tire you out until you believe me.
Sounds good.
All right, we'll give Marcus another shot here.
Oh.
Uh-oh.
It's very sad.
Somebody else is free to go while he experiments.
Very appropriately.
Rachel, can I ask just a couple of clarifying questions?
Oh, of course.
One is, when in the study did you ask the stereotype questions? Were those asked pre-treatment? Because that's important.
Yes, it is. Absolutely. So I believe I did ask them pre-treatment, and so they have been primed. So I think that would affect how you would interpret the results.
Well, that's okay. I mean, I think it's better that they're asked pre-treatment than post, right? Unless they're really sticky, and then you could test that, right? But I guess the question I had was whether or not these were actually potentially affected by your treatment, or whether or not they were really, sort of predispositions, attitudes that the people held before they were exposed to the treatment. So clarifying that in the paper would be helpful.
I will definitely clarify that. And I should also say they were part of a big block where I asked about stereotypes of a bunch of other groups in order to construct a general ethnocentrism measure. Because one of the things I wanted to be able to control for is like, are we activating stereotypes of Muslims, or are we just activating people's general ethnocentrism, which can often have some of the same effects. So they came before the experiment. So I don't think the question clued them in to which group they were going to later be asked about.
That actually wasn't my concern. My concern was just the sequencing of the study and whether or not they were asked pre-treatment. Making some of that clear in the paper would be helpful. It also wasn't clear how you dealt with the issue of deception. This seems like kind of a critical deception that you're carrying out here.
I didn't deceive them. I told them it was a hypothetical.
Oh, okay. Because that's not, somehow that didn't come across.
Oh no, that's terrible. I can't believe I forgot to put that in there.
It might have been in there. I didn't see if it was. And then on the dependent variable, I just wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about your conception of threat and what you're trying to capture here, because you talk about sort of the creation of an enemy, and that's been talked about here so far in this workshop. But the dependent variable is twofold. One is the threat perception with respect to the U.S., where I'm based, if I'm a participant in your study, and the other is my sense of whether or not this state is a threat to another state, right, which is a really qualitatively different kind of threat, right? It's really more of an assessment. I'm not sure how much emotion is bound up in that, assessment, right? And how much real concern I have. And so I guess I would just wanted to hear you talk a little bit about like what's most important to you in terms of capturing this dependent variable. Is it our image of the enemy, personal threat that the enemy poses to me or my loved ones or my country, or just an more cognitive assessment of the extent to which this is a dangerous state?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. So I think I need to think more about this. But the one that I really care about is perception of threat to the United States. And I've actually thought in future iterations, I want to break it up in the way that you just said. Like, is it actually a literal threat to me personally? Am I worried that I'm going to be harmed? Am I worried that other citizens are going to be harmed within the borders of the United States? Am I worried about US military forces abroad? So there's these expanding sort of circles in which we might locate the threat. I sort of threw the Israel question on there not very thoughtfully, mostly because I think whenever we talk about threats in the Middle East, and particularly the development of nuclear weapons, often much of the conversation is about the threat that poses to Israel. So I basically was like, let's see what happens with it. And it looks very different. I think you're right to point out that it's maybe a very different process by which people evaluate the threat to me as opposed to the threat to someone else, even if I have a strong attachment to that other person. So given that the results differed quite substantially, I think that bears much more thinking about it theoretically. I don't know if in future iterations I will stick with the same scenario. So it may become a moot point. Or maybe it could be an interesting aspect of the project to think theoretically through differences in how people evaluate threat to themselves versus US allies, which I think is still very much, an important part of sort of how public opinion forms on a lot of the foreign policy challenges that we face.
Okay, I think we're going to give Marcus another shot.
Okay. Oh, Marcus, I'm sorry.
It's very frustrating.
It is, and we had his audio at the beginning, so this is,
Really?
this is strange.
Marcus, if you have short questions, you can type them in. We can read them out.
It's a great idea, yeah.
Oh, while Marcus is typing, I wanted to just make a pitch for another set of literature, just in case we don't have enough to read. So it strikes me that one of the things that's going on is you're getting, in some ways, a backlash effect from your treatment. Well, it's unclear to me whether it's a backlash effect or you're just getting kind of polarized effects of your treatment. But there is a literature in public health on reactants. So this is a literature about what happens when you have messages that seem manipulative to people, and particularly when they're very visceral and they are perceived to be pushing people in a direction that they don't want. Sometimes what happens when you get messages that you don't like and they're very vivid is that you do exactly the opposite of what the message suggests. And so I think to the extent that you're going to start working, if you're going to push in the direction of really thinking about violent images, and thinking about what happens to those people who are very warm toward Muslims, even though they're a relatively small proportion of the representative public, you may just get really big backlash effects among this small part of the public. And so I think it's worth looking a little bit at that literature to think about, either creating the messages that are typical in the news, which may lead to these backlashes among certain groups, but to not be surprised if you find them, or to think about messages that you think might be kind of maybe less vivid, and then can get through the perceptual screen of people based on their kind of attitudes about Muslims. So
yeah, that's a great suggestion. I'll definitely take a look at it. So it's reactance, is that what you said?
yeah,
Okay.
I mean that's a very old and kind of it's somewhat problematic literature, but I find these, like, I don't know if you've ever found this, Liz, but I mean, backlash effects in experiments are real, and so I think it's worth thinking, particularly when you're if you're gonna work with images that people might feel like are manipulative, if that's the way you're gonna go. Yeah. You need to know that might happen ahead of time. My hand has had a bunch of these kind of backlash effects, not with imagery, but the reactance literature in public health is more about how images and tied to messages might, it's like fear appeals about, dental work and other things that lead people to do like exactly the opposite of what's intended by the message.
I think that's a great suggestion, and seems, not just important for, getting the treatments right and interpreting them correctly, but it also seems like when the stuff actually appears in the media, that could be a real phenomenon. How does the choice of image happen? Do certain images actually provoke these kind of backlash effects? There does seem to be a fine line between sort of achieving the impact on the people that you want, perhaps to think in a certain way and not pissing off everybody
exactly.
else. Right. Yeah, so that's a great suggestion. I love reading this stuff, so it's fine with me that you put more of my reading list.
Okay.
So Rachel, can you see Marcus's comments on GChat, or do we need to read those?
Let me see. I might not be.
Oh, they're there.
I see that he has joined the group chat.
Okay.
Oh, you have to go back to the GChat, which would be on Gmail.
Oh, okay. Let me do that.
I'll read them aloud anyway, just to get them onto the video. Marcus says, I think it would be helpful to engage with work on emotion. Blaker, Hutchinson, Fierk all talk about visuality. And I think this would be helpful because there isn't much on the theory side regarding the mechanism. It's hard to show that an image activates an outgroup stereotype because that is internal to the person's mind. And if you were to propose a theoretical mechanism that is based in existing lit in emotion, such as fear, then I think this would help you to connect the dots a little bit theoretically.
1 second, just writing that down. Well, thank you, Marcus. That's a really helpful suggestion. I should think more about the role of emotion, especially if I'm going to focus on images specifically, and images of faces. One of the things that, is supposed to be particularly powerful about images and images of other human beings is their ability to invoke emotion. And I agree that there's not a lot of mechanism here. I just sort of like black box it, right? You get an image, a stereotype pops into your head, you respond a certain way, and I'm sort of viewing the inputs and outputs and not really doing anything about the mechanism. And that's something that I've dinged lots of people for in writing reviews and whatnot. So it's good to hear that that more of that would be valuable in this paper, and the suggestion of the emotions literature, I think, sounds like exactly the right place to start.
Okay, I had one more comment I'll read. His reaction was also similar on the faces bit, wondering if the actual face is doing the work or the military uniform.
Yeah.
He echoes the idea of trying to figure out a way to maintain as much similarity between the images to really get at what's doing the work. Is that Todorov is thinking about this in terms of actual faces, distances between nose and lips, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, so I get inspired by Todorov and all the faces stuff, and I have some ideas about sort of facial features and expressions. And I've actually played around with his faces data sets, which are fun and make me feel cool and tech savvy, even though I'm really not. But yeah, I think actually it would be a really interesting avenue to explore both sort of theoretically and then in terms of the design, and to have more cells, as has been suggested, right, to think about what images could invoke violence or militarism, but that don't provide a face. And so to kind of separate out those effects, because yeah, he has a different facial expression. Obviously, he's wearing a headscarf in one and not in the other, which should sort of signal religion, but then he's also wearing the military uniform. And so perhaps anyone in a military uniform, or a picture of a Jordanian rocket or some Jordanian soldiers, you know, maybe that would really produce the same effect, because we're just getting people to think about violence, and therefore they're perceiving sort of more threat. Yeah, so definitely I can have more than 2 experimental conditions. I mean, you never see anything with just 2 conditions. So I have a lot of room actually to add things. This is not one of those cases where I already have like 12 cells and people are suggesting adding 82 more conditions. So I definitely have room to expand this a lot. And I think it's absolutely crucial, you know, in future iterations, if I think faces matter specifically, both to make that case more clearly theoretically, and then to be very careful about sorting out the effect of the face versus other things that might trigger some of the same mechanisms.
Okay, great. I think we have probably time for one more comment if somebody had something else pressing they wanted to talk about.
I would just say, as a presentational thing, that experimentalists are going to want you to show the main effect first. I was like, where's the main effect? And I get it that the effect is actually conditional on this other set of things, but it's a little bit confusing to go right into what's this effect of the treatment on the stereotype. You know, how does that interact on this dependent variable? So I would just say, thinking about, I know you don't want to show it if it doesn't, if it's not significant, but there's some really interesting underlying differences. And so you first have to show at least that the main effect isn't there before going on.
No, that makes total sense. And other people have said the same, and that it seems like I'm trying to hide it, which I'm definitely not. I mean, the results are what the results are.
Yeah.
I'm gonna jump in, even though now I'm out of turn because it was only one more comment. But I just want to say for those here who may not know, and also the many who access the online archive, that the TESS project is back up and running and funded. And so that would be a fantastic, place for you to seek out support for taking this project forward.
Yeah, that's definitely on my agenda, and I'm so excited that it's back. I was checking regularly. So yes, everybody.
We all were.
Should inundate them with applications.
Well, great. Just kind of in closing, Rachel, we had some technical difficulties at the beginning on the screen share with your slides, so they didn't.
Oh, no.
So they don't appear on the video. I think you can work with maybe Peter and Emily if you're willing to share your slides and let them post them on the website.
Of course. Oh no, I hope that wasn't my fault. I could see them, but that's not really the point. So
it's kind of our fault. We were indecisive early on, and you were deep enough into the presentation where we let it go.
So I was just talking, and you were looking at a blank screen.
That's fine. I think it worked out quite well anyway. Do you want to say anything in closing while we wrap up?
Sure. Well, I mean, the first thing I should say is just, again, to thank you all for participating. And these were really helpful comments. In the past, I've gotten comments more from like a mainstream IR kind of audience, so I know what they would say, but they did not give me the same kind of helpful literature suggestions and suggestions about design and thinking through mechanisms that I got from this experience. So I'm extremely grateful for the opportunity to participate in this. It's really cool. Shout out, everyone should do it. I mean, I think, this has made me excited to, go back and revise this project, read more, I think the idea of sort of where enemies come from and how they get constructed is interesting, and to hear that, that some of you also share that interest gives me increased motivation to really work on it. So hopefully you will see future iterations of this paper and you will recognize your fingerprints on it. So thank you very much for taking the time and reading closely. I really appreciate it.
And we look forward to seeing future iterations. Thank you, Rachel Stein, for presenting the paper. I want to thank all the discussants for their excellent time and consideration they put into the paper. You can find the manuscript on the Peace Science website under the Colloquium tab. You can also get back and watch the video. We'll have it archived on the YouTube channel. And so people can comment there on the YouTube channel or email comments to the author. And then I would like to invite everybody back on December 16th, where Kathy Wu will be presenting Public Resolve, Endogenous Publicity, and Crisis Bargaining. Thanks, everyone.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.